Welcome to this week's Situation Room, where today's episode dives deep into a series of unfolding global events that just demand our attention. From the sands of the Middle East to the troubled borders of the United States, from the strategic waterways of the Horn of Africa to the chaotic streets of Haiti, we're covering pivotal stories that are shaping our world. First, we explore a tragic incident in Jordan, where a drone strike at an American base has escalated tensions in an already volatile region, with 3 US soldiers killed and dozens wounded. We delve into the ramifications of this attack, its impact on US military strategy, and the broader geopolitical chess game involving Iran's shadowy influence in the Middle East. Next, we're going to shift our focus to the Horn of Africa, where Al-Shabaab's declaration of war against Ethiopia marks a new chapter in this regional conflict. As Ethiopia seeks strategic depth in Somaliland, the move has sparked widespread protests and a potential recruitment bonanza for one of the region's most dangerous terror groups. We'll unpack the implications of this conflict and what it means for the stability of an already fragile region. Our third story takes us to the US-Mexico border, where Texas's unprecedented standoff against federal authorities over immigration enforcement has ignited a firestorm of political and legal controversy. With razor-wire National Guard troops and defiant stance from Governor Greg Abbott, we explored the potential for this confrontation to redefine the balance of power between state and federal governments in America. And finally, we turn our attention to Haiti, a country on the brink of collapse under the weight of gang violence and political turmoil. As Kenya's High Court blocks a crucial international intervention, the future of Haiti hangs in the balance. We'll discuss the desperate plan for security from Haitian citizens, the complex web of international relations at play, and the potential paths forward for a nation in crisis. So, let's jump into it, shall we? Now, our lead story today is out of the Middle Eastern nation of Jordan, where 3 service members of the United States military were killed in a drone attack on an American base. 34 other American troops were wounded in an incident that marks the first American frontline deaths of the Middle East's ongoing crisis. This as the entire region is on a hair trigger, with Israel at war with Hamas, the Houthi rebels of Yemen at war with international shipping, and a wide range of other Iranian-backed militias and other armed groups taking the opportunity for a mass exercise in bloodletting. The attack of US troops came on Sunday, January the 28th, in the early hours in the morning at an American logistics outpost called Tower 22. That outpost is a temporary home for roughly 350 American troops, mostly from the US Army, whose primary role is to support a coalition still conducting counterinsurgency operations against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They do so at a strategically significant location, where Jordan's northeast tip sort of wedges its way in between Syrian and Iraqi territory. Tower 22 is one of about a dozen bases scattered between Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, hosting about 7,400 troops in total across the 3 nations. And while Tower 22 hasn't been much of a target prior to the most recent attack, America's wide network of bases has been under sustained threat in the area for months now. The culprits, in a series of earlier strikes that all failed to claim American lives, are a loose network of militias in Iraq and Syria who violently oppose the United States' continued presence there. The common thread between those militias is that they all draw direct financial, weapon, and logistical support, as well as a level of tactical guidance from Iran. Now, at the time of writing, it's still early in the wake of the attack on Tower 22, and there are still lots of specifics that the world just doesn't know, but already we can paint a pretty clear picture of the strike as it unfolded. The enemy drone flew in toward Tower 22 in the small hours of the morning, as most American troops on the base were still asleep in their bunks. The drone, believed to be an Iranian-made Shahed model, approached by flying low and slow toward Tower 22 in a likely attempt to avoid being spotted on radar. At around the same time, an American drone was returning to Tower 22, and preliminary reports around the attack have indicated that the presence of this known incoming drone caused Tower 22's counter-drone interception systems to be briefly disarmed. With that mistake made, there was no effort to shoot down the Shahed drone before it struck. And when it did, it hit a group of trailers at Tower 22 that were serving as a makeshift barracks. One trailer was impacted directly, while several others sustained damage due to the blast wave and the resulting debris. 3 Americans killed in the strike have been named, all of whom were US Army soldiers from the state of Georgia. Sergeant William Jerome Rivers, Specialists Kennedy Sanders, and Breonna Moffett. Upwards of 40 other soldiers were injured, including 8 who had to be evacuated out of Jordan in order to receive urgent medical care elsewhere. Among both the evacuated troops and the ones who remained at Tower 22, traumatic brain injuries remain widespread. And that's an ongoing theme that's been reported among the 70 or more US troops that have been wounded in the border wave of drone and missile attacks by militias in the last several months. Now, the group thought to be responsible for the attack is the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, an umbrella organization that accounts for a wide range of Iran-backed militia groups in Iraq's northern provinces. Over the weekend, the organization took responsibility for 3 attacks on enemy bases, including one located in the same area as Tower 22, although they didn't take credit for the attack on Tower 22 explicitly. The organization structures itself in a way that makes it difficult to know just who, under their broad umbrella, is responsible for a given attack, and that opacity is made all the more frustrating by the ease of which members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, specifically the elite Quds Force, seem to float between the individual militias involved. So that intentional vagueness among the ranks of the Islamic resistance in Iraq appears to be paying dividends internationally. In the United States, President Joe Biden issued a statement in the immediate aftermath of the attack, and one that confirmed just how difficult it was to pinpoint the precise group of individuals responsible. Said Biden, "While we are still gathering the facts of this attack, we know it was carried out by radical Iran-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iraq. Have no doubt, we will hold all those responsible to account at a time and in a manner of our choosing." End quote. It was a clear, firm promise of retribution from the Biden administration and an uncharacteristically blunt show of tit-for-tat, one that we must acknowledge was made by a relatively unpopular president during an election year.
There will be consequences.
But, promise or not, it's difficult to pinpoint any real mechanism at Biden's disposal to identify the specific group responsible within the Islamic resistance in Iraq. Across the divide, Iran has attempted to deflect blame for the attack. As Iranian state news organization IRNA said after the strike, Iran has no connection and had nothing to do with the attack on the US base. End quote. While the eventual deaths of at least a small number of American troops has been regarded as an eventuality in the Middle East amidst the recent waves of bombardment, the current situation and Biden's clear promise of retribution have made it clear that this is the moment when US readiness to intervene directly will be put to the test. What sort of contingency plans the US has drawn up for a situation like this remains to be seen. However, the most immediate question at hand is whether the US will make any effort at all to pinpoint the group who launched the Shahad drone themselves. Instead, the US could choose to retaliate against other Islamic resistance targets or against other elements of Iran's international network, like Syrian militias or the Houthi rebels in Yemen. Or there's the direct retaliation option, the one that presumes international agreement on, or at least acceptance of, the premise that Iran is behind these attacks across the Middle East. That option is the one Iran seems now to be working to avoid. A strike not against an Iranian proxy, but against Iran itself. The American White House has been clear that it does not seek a war with Iran, but whether it will avoid retaliatory strikes in order to do so, or simply claim that a single retaliatory strike should put an end to the current round of escalation, we'll have to find out in time. But we emphasize the need for presumption of Iranian guilt, because the idea that Iran was complicit in this attack is not something that we can just take for granted. Yeah, the Islamic resistance in Iraq is an Iran-backed organization that receives its direct support, and yes, the 28th of January attack used an Iranian-designed Shahed drone, most likely manufactured in Iran itself. We've got to emphasize that Iran's proxy forces do not belong to Iran, and while they may be willing to accept strategic guidance and even direct orders from Iran, they are very much their own actors, more than capable of planning and carrying out attacks that go beyond Iran's direction. The leader of the Lebanese political and militant organization has suggested as much, claiming recently that Iran has pushed these aligned militias to create their own networks of connections and fight their own battles for their own interests. It's even an open question whether Iran had any direct involvement with the tactical planning of Hamas's October the 7th attack, or whether it was more a case of Hamas choosing to plan and launch an attack that it believed would be in Iran's mutual interest. The problem with all of that is that America now has to be careful in figuring out just how involved Iran was and who they would have been involved with in order to form a plan for a retaliatory strike at all. If that information is not yet forthcoming, then it's on the US and the Biden administration to assess whether they'll wait to clarify the distinction or whether they even care about it. Their response, both immediately and in the longer term, will be telling. In recent weeks, sentiment among Americans has led the national news media to question whether the US is already at war with the Houthi rebels in Yemen and with Iran's broader axis of resistance across the Middle East. Or if it isn't, then what about America's current situation is any different than what a war would practically be? And not only that, but Biden faces intense pressure from America's political conservatives in leadership. Senator Roger Wicker, highest-ranking Republican on the US Senate Armed Services Committee, has called for a direct retaliation against Iranian leadership, while Senator Tom Cotton, also a Republican, has stated that the, quote, only answer to these attacks must be devastating retaliation against Iran's terrorist forces both in Iran and across the Middle East. quote ends. When the United States chooses a path forward, reeling from the first direct killings of American soldiers of this entire conflict, it's likely to open a new chapter in the ongoing Middle East crisis. And now we move to our story about Ethiopia. Considering it was a deal about leasing land for a port, you might be forgiven for thinking that the protests that followed were a little bit over the top. This past month, thousands of Somalis have taken to the streets of regions like Middle Juba, Lower Shabelle, Bakul, and Gedo to express their outrage. Online propaganda channels have talked about the need for a war of liberation against colonial occupiers. Now, if this sounds extreme, just know they weren't protesting any ordinary port deal here. Rather, it was a deal signed between Ethiopia and the breakaway region of Somaliland, an unrecognized state that sits on territory claimed by the internationally recognized government of Somalia. Nor were the protests that accompanied it by any definition ordinary. Instead, they were organized in large part by Al-Shabaab, one of the most dangerous terror groups in the Horn of Africa. And they may signal that the group is entering a new and worrying phase, one in which accelerated recruitment allows them to launch unprecedented attacks against Somalia's neighbors. To explain what's going on here, we first need to back up and examine the spark that caused this regional dumpster fire, that port deal. Technically a memorandum of understanding, the deal was inked on January the 1st between the Ethiopian government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and that of Somaliland under President Muse Bihi Abdi. Now, we've covered this deal in depth on the Situation Room before, so we won't reiterate everything here, but the main points for anyone who missed that episode are: 1. That Somaliland would lease 20 kilometers of coastline to landlocked Ethiopia for building a naval base and utilizing a port, and 2. In return, Ethiopia would become the first nation to recognize Somaliland's independence. And 3. Somalia is very, very unhappy about this. Nor is it just the Somalia government in Mogadishu that's upset. According to Al Jazeera, quote, the African Union, the Arab League, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the European Union, China, the United Kingdom, and the US have all come out against the plan. The reasons for this are relatively straightforward. Somaliland, despite being de facto independent since the early 1990s, is internationally recognized as part of Somalia. The global community's position is that governments recognizing breakaway states in Africa could lead to a tsunami of separatists taking up arms, so in their view, Ethiopia is not just playing with fire, but they're engaging in the geopolitical equivalent of that gasoline fight from Zoolander. But while there's a lot to dig into here, that's not the focus of our report today. Instead, we want to use this edition to focus on a much more narrow aspect of the port deal: how Al-Shabaab have managed to turn it into a recruitment goldmine. Although technically what War on the Rocks calls a transnational Salafi jihadist organization in its vision and ambitions and loyalty to Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab is really a lot more ethno-nationalist than that description suggests. All its leaders are Somalis, and the Institute for the Study of War describes their goals as, quote, advancing a pan-Somali narrative rooted in anti-Ethiopian sentiment to boost recruiting and funding support among the Somali population spread across the Horn of Africa. This includes ideas of liberating ethnic Somalis living in majority Christian nations like Ethiopia and Kenya, who they consider to be under colonial occupation. As the Council of Foreign Relations describes, quote, a common goal is an Islamic state that brings together all of East Africa's ethnic Somali areas. Where Ethiopia is concerned, these feelings are particularly intense. Not only is the country home to millions of Somalis, totaling around 7% of the Ethiopian population, but Addis Ababa's history of military interventions in Somalia in part helped fuel Al-Shabaab's rise. Somalia's utter collapse in 1991, you see, led to various jihadist groups popping up in the country. Starting in the mid-90s, Ethiopia launched a series of military incursions to stamp them out. In 2006, though, Addis Ababa went one step further, launching a 3-year invasion and occupation of its neighbor. At the time, Al-Shabaab was a relatively small new group on the jihadist scene. With a name meaning the youth, it wasn't yet on many people's radar. But the Ethiopian invasion changed all of that. In the years of fighting that followed, the dominant Somali Islamic groups disintegrated, allowing newer factions to ride a wave of national anger to prominence. Years later, counterterrorism expert Rob Wise would tell the Council on Foreign Relations that the occupation was instrumental in, quote, transforming Al-Shabaab from a small, relatively unimportant part of a more moderate Islamic movement into the most powerful and radical armed faction in the country. Ever since those bloody days, Addis Ababa has been one of the main boogeymen in Somalia and a key part of Al-Shabaab propaganda. propaganda that depicts Ethiopia as planning to, per the ISW, quote, enslave Somalia, revive an Ethiopian empire, and control Somali's seaports. So, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced his deal to lease 20 kilometers of Somaliland coastline, it was perhaps the biggest PR gift that the jihadists could have hoped for. And it's certainly not one they've wasted. Since the Memorandum of Understanding was signed, Al-Shabaab has churned out propaganda designed to capitalize on broader Somali outrage, declaring that the deal, quote, violates Somalia's sovereignty and claiming Muslims have a, again, quoting, religious obligation to oppose it. In this, they've ironically been helped by the government of Somalia itself. Like Al-Shabaab, the government in Mogadishu has issued bellicose statements against Ethiopia, including making over-the-top threats of war. Now, these threats are best understood as bluster. Despite its military being badly weakened by the 2-year Tigray War and fighting multiple insurgencies since, Ethiopia would steamroller Somalia if conflict erupted. Still, the statements from Mogadishu are both reflecting and amplifying genuine rage amongst ordinary Somalis, a rage Al-Shabaab is now trying to capitalize on. In the group's heartlands of south and central Somalia, they've organized mass protests and called for jihad against Addis Ababa. As War on the Rocks explains, quoting, popular Somali anger over the memorandum as well as the current war in Gaza offers Al-Shabaab new opportunities to spread its violent message, recruit more widely, and encourage or inspire supporters to take up violence. So far, this has led mostly to a spike in recruitment, but it's what comes next that's concerning experts right now. The possibility that the group capitalizes on this issue to launch massive attacks within Ethiopia itself. Although the country has long been an Al-Shabaab target, it's only in recent years that the group has managed to cause serious trouble there. In 2022, as the Tigray War devastated Ethiopia's north, the group took advantage of the chaos to launch an incursion, one which lasted several days and killed dozens of Ethiopian soldiers. While the attack was ultimately defeated, Al-Shabaab has since maintained a small but significant presence on Ethiopian soil. According to the ISW, as many as 500 militants may be operating out of a base in the mountains that run alongside the Ethiopia-Kenya border. Now look, that's a relatively small number, but with Addis Ababa distracted by multiple internal conflicts and insurgencies, it may be enough to cause trouble. Already analysts are reporting that Al-Shabaab intends to launch new attacks inside Ethiopia in the coming months, escalating its war against the state. More concerning for the global community, though, might be the broader ways in which Al-Shabaab could use this port deal to destabilize the region. As we mentioned earlier, the terror group are not alone in condemning Addis Ababa's deal with Somaliland. The government of Somalia has likewise begun issuing bellicose rants against it. But with Al-Shabaab running a far more heated PR campaign against the deal, there's a worry that the Somali government will feel a need to outflank them on nationalist rhetoric. To quote the Council on Foreign Relations, by condemning the port access deal, Al-Shabaab seeks to position itself as a champion of Somalia's territorial integrity and to undercut support for the transitional federal government. This puts pressure on Somalia's president, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, to push back on Ethiopia with even more vigor. Again, Somalia does not have the military capacity to win a conflict with Ethiopia, but that simply means Mogadishu might feel compelled to react in smaller, yet still self-defeating ways. One possibility floated by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project is that Somalia might order the expulsion of Ethiopian troops. Currently, Addis Ababa maintains at least 5,000 soldiers in Somaliland split across 2 missions. These troops are helping fight Al-Shabaab and were partially responsible for a recent series of victories that have seen the militants placed on the back foot in multiple regions. In fact, recent campaigns have been so successful that Mogadishu has declared its intention to liberate all Al-Shabaab-held territory in the south by the end of 2024, expel Ethiopia's troops, and that simply isn't going to happen. And that would be a major problem for one of Mogadishu's major international backers, the United States. The US has long held an interest in seeing terror networks in Somalia disrupted, not least because of their ability to threaten American interests in Africa and beyond. Al-Shabaab is particularly irksome because they've proven adept at recruiting Somalis living in the United States. Dozens of American citizens from the Somali diaspora have traveled to the country to take up arms for Al-Shabaab, more so than for any other group. While it's nowhere near as high up Washington's list of global priorities as, say, Taiwan or Ukraine, it's still US policy to see Al-Shabaab defeated and government control restored over the whole of Somalia. A massive bust-up between Mogadishu and Addis Ababa would jeopardize those plans. So that's where things stand at the time of writing, 1st of February, with Al-Shabaab acting as the potential wildcard in what's already become an incredibly tense game of poker in the Horn of Africa, a game in which the stakes are sea access for Ethiopia and recognition for Somaliland, and preserving territorial integrity for Somalia. A game which could easily end with everyone pulling guns on one another. Hopefully, of course, that's not going to happen. Hopefully, Addis Ababa will back away from the port deal and tensions will cool once more. But if Ethiopia doesn't change course, then we should be prepared for unexpected events. Events in which Somalia's most dangerous terror group may yet play a critical part. And from Somalia, we turn to America, where a standoff deep in the Texas borderlands with Mexico threatens to become a violent fissure point in a starkly divided nation. On the one side, the United States federal government, primarily the US Border Patrol and other officials from the Department of Homeland Security. On the other, the state of Texas, under the leadership of Governor Greg Abbott, drawing military force from the Texas National Guard, the Texas Rangers, and the Texas State Guard. Also on Abbott and the Texans' side is the verbal support and endorsement of the governors of 25 other US states, as well as the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, the lower of 2 federal legislative bodies in the US. It's the first American military standoff over immigration in modern history, and it may be the start of a modern constitutional crisis. The issue at hand in the standoff is Texas Governor Abbott's decision to place razor wire along sections of the state's border with Mexico over and above the wishes of the federal government. Now, for our international viewers who've been lucky enough to tune out the madness of American domestic politics, first of all, well, we're jealous, and second, there are 3 pieces of critical context to understand here. First, the United States' constant influx of migrants from South and Central America through Mexico's land border along the southern edge of the US is a flaming hot political issue right now, and it has been for a long while. Second, the right, or lack thereof, of Texas, a US state, to make its own decisions about its own border falls into a much broader sort of controversy. States' rights. That is, the question of what states can choose to do on their own authority is an ongoing and constant debate within the US. And third, US President Joe Biden has long sought to take a stance against the more harsh border control policies of his predecessor Donald Trump, but that decision has made the already unpopular president into a lightning rod for criticism on the American right. Biden's efforts to control the border situation in response have been largely ignored in favor of political expediency from his opponents, who instead magnified the real failings of a border policy that has led to a humanitarian crisis and even more political polarization among US citizens. Governor Abbott's decision to string coiled and very sharp concertina wire along parts of his state's border, and specifically on the Texas side of a treacherous border river called the Rio Grande, is a direct response to this nationwide frustration. Amidst fears that the wire could ensnare migrants, including the many young children that cross the border each day, the US federal government has been looking to cut the wire for some time. But on January the 10th of this year, the Abbott administration in Texas signed an emergency declaration to close a small section of Parkland where federal border patrol agents have been holding and processing migrants. And well, the current mess of tensions began to escalate. Days after the closure, the 33-year-old woman and her 2 children were found drowned in the Rio Grande, an incident that the Federal Border Patrol claims they knew about but hadn't been able to intervene in because they had been restricted from accessing the area. The claim has since been retracted, but at the time, it was taken as an indication that Texas really was obstructing the ability of the federal government to do its job. Even after the Federal Justice Department clarified that it had already been told by Mexico that the migrants had drowned by the time they requested permission to enter the park, it continued to insist that the state of Texas had made any level of direct intervention impossible anyway. From there, the next escalation came when on January the 22nd, the US Supreme Court ordered that federal border patrol officers could indeed cut the concertina wire and dismantle other barriers used by states. That decision, made from the highest judicial office in the United States, overrode the authority of a lower court with jurisdiction over Texas and 2 other states, a process that, in the eyes of already skeptical states' rights advocates, looked a whole lot like the federal government overruling a decision that belonged in the hands of Texas itself. Texas was defiant in the face of the ruling. In a conversation with Fox News host Martha McCullum, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick said, "We are putting up wire, Martha, everywhere we can. We will continue. We will not stop it. If they cut it, we will replace it." Governor Abbott, who had spent weeks rallying against the, quote, invasion that Texas faces from its southern border, took the opportunity to again reiterate his claim that Texas's authority and that of any state should supersede the decisions made by federal courts, legislatures, or agencies. Now, these are claims that have long been settled in the United States. In fact, they were decided pretty authoritatively during the US Civil War. But that hasn't stopped Abbott or a range of other states' rights enthusiasts in the US from trying to enact their beliefs over the top of the US Constitution, and that broader trend certainly wasn't going to stop just because the Supreme Court said so. Thus, we find the United States in its current position, with the Texas National Guard and US Border Patrol in a full-on standoff in Shelby Park, part of the humble little town of Eagle Pass. The Biden administration issued Texas an ultimatum to clear the park. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton issued a scathing rebuttal that accused the president of misunderstanding the nature of federal and state laws themselves, and Governor Abbott announced that Texas would be defending its own sovereignty in the matter, barring federal authorities from entering the park by force if necessary. Said Abbott, instead of prosecuting immigrants for the federal crime of illegal entry, President Biden has sent his lawyers into federal courts to sue Texas for taking action to secure the border. Abbott's cause was picked up nationwide, with every Republican state governor except for one, that's 25 in total, throwing their support behind Texas. So, has the Republican Governors Association, who issued a statement that they stand with Abbott, quote, in utilizing every tool and strategy, including razor-wire fences, to secure the border? So has the Republican Governors Association, who issued a statement that they stand with Abbott, quote, in utilizing every tool and strategy, including razor-wire fences, to secure the border. Texas Senator Ted Cruz has endorsed Abbott's action, and when asked on television whether this was a defining moment to challenge the US government to come and enforce their laws by force, Cruz responded, absolutely. We're defending Texas and defending this country. Large swaths of the US Congress, including the Republican Speaker of the House, have indicated that they feel similarly. Even the current frontrunner for the Republican nomination for president, former President Donald Trump, has voiced his support of Abbott, posting online, Biden is, unbelievably, fighting to tie the hands of Governor Abbott and the state of Texas so that the invasion continues unchecked. Texas has rightly invoked the invasion clause of the Constitution and must be given full support to repel the invasion. The issue with all that is that the position of those Republicans is broadly understood to be in direct contradiction to the US Constitution, and it's not hard to see why. According to one law professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Stephen Vladek, quote, by this logic, states could use their own determination that an invasion exists as a justifying for usurping control of whichever federal policies they don't like. The right of the states to defend themselves does not, and was never meant to, provide a hook for supplanting federal authority. The quote ends. But while that sentiment is certainly not unique to Vladek, and constitutional scholars across the United States broadly agree that Abbott cannot go unchallenged on this issue, Biden's options to resolve the dispute non-violently are pretty limited. He can attempt to federalize the Texas National Guard, which several prominent Texas Democrats are urgently pushing him to do, but there's no guarantee that the Texas National Guard will listen. Not only is Biden's legal case for federalization somewhat limited, but it would also turn it into a political liability for him down the road, and it would force the Texas National Guard into a position where legally it must side with the federal government, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will. If Biden avoids federalization, he may leave a door open for several other state governors to make good on their pledges to send their own National Guard regiments to Eagle Pass in a stunning show of solidarity that would have major consequences of its own. And the combined National Guard detachments of America's most right-leaning states, formidable and well-armed as they may be, aren't the only people Texas has on its side in the standoff. Beside the state's official militia, the 1,600-strong Texas State Guards, and the state's 200-odd Texas Rangers, Abbott's cause has been a sounding call for militias, far-right extremists, and other groups who are generally open to the idea of rallying against the federal government. While that group isn't necessarily a high percentage of the United States' 331 million people, it's certainly a high number of individual people. And with 2023 polls finding that nearly 1 in 4 Americans would endorse the use of political violence to, quote, save the United States, a crisis like this immediately has the potential to become a new flagship issue for people already open to political resistance. Although a militia convoy headed toward Texas from Virginia, the so-called Take Our Border Back convoy has failed to pick up steam, skepticism from would-be participants that the operation might itself be a government ploy. America's far-right online environment appears to have no qualms about the broader concept of direct militia intervention in the crisis, though. A February 3rd rally has been scheduled to happen near Eagle Pass itself, presenting a possible deadline for Abbott civilian supporters to make their presence known. And make no mistake, this is an issue over which many people in the United States would be more than happy to pop off. Anti-immigrant rhetoric is at an all-time high within America's political right, helped along by statements like this one from former president and presumptive 2024 presidential nominee Donald Trump, quoting, They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just in 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country. The quote ends. A very large portion of the American public takes its cues from leaders like Trump, Abbott, and a range of other figures who've since endorsed Texas's line in the sand, and that portion of the population happens to generally overlap with the portion of Americans who are particularly enthusiastic about owning high-powered firearms or rallying against the idea of federal overreach. It's not a coincidence that Texas's own militias have chosen to side with Abbott here, and Abbott knows it. When it comes to the big question, namely, is this standoff in Texas about to kick off a second American Civil War, we're pretty confident in telling you that America is going to survive this one. But even in a country known for its stark internal divisions and for a political environment in which allegiance to one side seems to fundamentally alienate most citizens to the other, the standoff at Eagle Pass is a powerful reminder that American unity cannot be taken for granted. As all this has unfolded in Texas, Donald Trump has pressured Republican legislatures to vote against a bill that would allow President Biden to intervene in the border issue more directly, not on grounds that it should be the state's responsibility to enforce border security, but because any improvement at the border itself might be seen as a win for Biden. In an increasingly extreme political party willing to flaunt the authority of its own federal Supreme Court just a couple of years after a large-scale insurrection inside the US Capitol itself, it's no stretch at all to see the events at Eagle Pass as another step in a much longer cascade, or to wonder with real trepidation about where that cascade might ultimately lead. And finally today, to Haiti. Now for listeners to Haitian radio, it was a day to remember, the sort that audio archivists might preserve for future historians. For hours on Friday the 26th of January, radio stations across the Caribbean country were paralyzed with calls. People from all walks of life were phoning in to vent their frustration, their anger, to above all, articulate one very important question: what the hell do we do now? It's a question the international community is only too familiar with in regard to Haiti, a Massachusetts-sized country of 11.4 million people that's home to some of the worst gang violence in the world. But it's also one that has become increasingly urgent. The trigger for the outpour of panic on Haitian radio last Friday came not from Haiti itself, but a country 12,000 kilometers away. Specifically, it came from Kenya, where a court had just ruled that Nairobi's plan to deploy 1,000 police officers to Haiti was illegal. Although the government of President William Ruto has vowed to challenge the decision, the deployment is now on indefinite hold. And that's a major problem for Haiti, because those 1,000 Kenyan police officers were supposed to lead a multinational force to break the gang's grip on power and restore order. As the foreign minister told the UN Security Council with a hint of desperation, the Haitian people cannot take any more. And he wasn't exaggerating. Almost uniquely among Latin American nations, Haiti's gang violence has gotten so out of control that the entire country resembles an active war zone. While countries like Mexico and Honduras may be suffering dizzying levels of gang-related violence, they're still able to function as nations. People can still commute to work, kids can go to school, the economy hums along. In Haiti, by contrast, the danger of kidnapping or murder is so great that the schools are mostly shut. Rather than commute, people cower in their homes. Gangs don't just control the streets, they occupy former government buildings and burn down entire city blocks. So unstable is the situation that the economy has contracted for 5 years in a row. As the head of the UN office in Haiti, Maria Isabel Salvador, recently told the Security Council, quote, "I cannot overstress the severity of the situation in Haiti, where multiple protracted crises have reached a critical point." Now, this crisis is something we've covered on War Graphics before in 2 full videos, plus a Situation Room segment last fall. So we're not going to go into all the background details again here. Needless to say, you can check out our previous episodes for the in-depth story. But we do think it's important to highlight exactly how bad gang violence has become. To put some figures on what might otherwise sound like hyperbole. Because when it comes to discussing Haiti's plight, fact is infinitely more nightmarish than fiction. To begin, let's talk about the most obvious stat of all, the apocalyptic murder rate. In 2023, the UN reports that over 4,789 people were murdered, about double the number killed in 2022. That works out at a homicide rate of about 41 per 100,000, far higher than Venezuela, Mexico, or Brazil, and somewhat higher than that of Honduras. In fact, the only Latin American nation to outstrip Haiti's murder rate was Ecuador. But Quito recently declared the country in a state of internal armed conflict. Haiti, by contrast, is technically at peace. As well as those murdered, almost 2,500 people were kidnapped last year, an estimated 80% jump from 2022. Right now, a mix of up to 300 gangs control 4/5 of the capital, Port-au-Prince, and their territory is expanding all the time. Just this January, gangs laid siege to the once peaceful neighborhood of Salino, burning homes and murdering residents in an area where many police officers live. With Salino no longer safe, it's thought the crime groups may soon expand into the last untouched areas in the capital. That means even the very richest sectors of Haitian society could soon be faced with the indignities the lower classes have already suffered for years. Kidnappings and murders, yeah, but also the depravity of gang-directed sexual assault. As the Washington Post recently described, quoting, "Gangs are using sexual assaults, including collective rapes, to instill fear, punish, subjugate, and inflict pain on local populations." Nor is it just Port-au-Prince that the gangs are brutalizing. The rice-producing region of Artibonite is suffering, increasing food insecurity for the entire nation. Key roads to other cities have been seized. Now, if you're wondering where the police are in all of this, the answer is mostly in hiding. Horrifically understaffed and underfunded, the Police Nationale de Haiti, usually referred to as the PNH, fields a mere 10,000 police officers for a nation of 11 million. As we mentioned in an earlier video, New York City alone has over 3 times that number. According to the UN, Haiti requires at least 25,000 active officers to stand a chance of controlling its streets. But rather than recruiting more officers, the PNH is hemorrhaging them. AP News reports that over 1,600 quit last year and nearly 50 were murdered. Those that remain have to deal with faulty equipment, poor salaries, and colleagues who are deep in the pockets of the gangs. And this is where Kenya was supposed to step in. By offering a large contingent of its own officers, Nairobi hoped to plug the gaps in the PNH, as well as offering training and weapons that would allow an effective fight back against the gangs. Nor would Kenya's officers be alone. Back in October 2023, the UN Security Council authorized a 1-year multinational security support mission following a request for intervention by Haiti's acting Prime Minister Ariel Henry the year before. UN backing meant Kenya would be able to lead a coalition force of 3,000, drawing from Caribbean countries like Jamaica and Belize, but also from other African countries like Senegal and Burundi. America, meanwhile, was going to take a background role, supporting the mission with $200 million, but not providing any personnel, part of a drive to ensure the intervention couldn't be painted as a colonial occupation. Although questions lingered over the Kenyan police force's suitability, not least the fact Kenya is English-speaking while Haitians speak French Creole, the deployment nonetheless gave a whole lot of people hope. As one Haitian interviewee told the New York Times, "If you ask people in Haiti what they need, it's security. The security the Kenyan-led mission was supposed to provide. Now, all that is up in the air." While the Kenyan government has 2 higher courts it can appeal to, the case could take months to be heard and may simply confirm the High Court's ruling. As a result, Haiti has effectively been abandoned days before a major political crisis erupts. Haiti's entire political system currently lacks almost any legitimacy. The last elections were held in 2016. Since then, the terms of all elected officials, from senators to local mayors, have expired. The president was assassinated in 2021. The current Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, wasn't elected but appointed by the president days before he was murdered. To make matters worse, Henry signed an accord in 2022 agreeing that his term would end on February 7th this year. As the United States Institute for Peace notes, quote, "The looming expiration of Henry's only claim to democratic legitimacy is likely to further deepen Haiti's political crisis." To paraphrase the question so many Haitians were asking on local radio last Friday, what the hell does the world do now? The sad truth is that there may not be anything that anyone can do. While there's no shortage of Haitian organizations saying this could be an opportunity to find a local solution to the crisis, the problem is that the country's elites are simply far too self-interested to make the necessary compromises. Despite the heroic efforts of groups like Montana Accord, Haiti is no closer to holding elections than it was in 2022. The 21st of December agreement that Henry signed that year promised a vote in 2023, but lack of support among opposition groups meant that never happened. And to be honest, while Henry has clearly outstayed his welcome, trying to hold a vote as the nation collapses seems less like trying to arrange deck chairs on the Titanic and more like standing atop Vesuvius as it erupts and arguing over what sunscreen to wear. The good news is that many Haitians recognize this. The bad news is that this might convince them to try extreme solutions. And the most extreme available right now is likely Guy Philippe. A former rebel against the Haitian state, Philippe served 9 years in a US prison for money laundering before being released and repatriated last year, a move that could soon become the Haitian equivalent of Lenin arriving in Petrograd in early 1917. Since his return, Philippe has toured the country, preaching armed revolution. Already this year, his supporters have paralyzed cities such as Jeremy and Miragoan. While it's unclear whether he has the popular support necessary to carry out his revolt, Philippe's ties to drug gangs and paramilitary suggest that he could be even worse than Henri if he succeeds. This is one of the nightmare scenarios that world powers are wrestling with, one in which Henri overstaying the expiration of his mandate triggers such popular anger that a gang-affiliated rebel like Philippe is able to rise to power and rule Haiti as a modern warlord. Of course, that won't necessarily happen. Another scenario is that widespread anger could lead to Henri's overthrow, followed by a swift collapse into nationwide chaos. This is the failed state scenario, one in which Haiti utterly falls apart with ripple effects across the region, one in which the USA is almost certainly forced to launch a military intervention to stop a North American Somalia from emerging on its doorstep. But thankfully, neither of these scenarios is inevitable. The Security Council authorization left the door open to another country leading the intervention if Kenya backed out. Someone could yet step up, or maybe an expedited ruling by the Kenyan Supreme Court will pave the way for the mission to go ahead. Militarily, the gangs themselves are pretty weak. If we're lucky, they'll hide their arms and melt away into the shadows the moment a real army shows up. Still, that is a lot of hypotheticals, far too many to be comfortable with when so much is at stake. Because whatever happens next, the one inarguable fact is that the people of Haiti continue to suffer in ways rarely seen outside war zones, living with daily atrocities that most of us can't imagine. For their sakes, we pray that a solution, however unlikely, is found soon. That for the first time in years, ordinary Haitians get a chance to experience that most ordinary and vital thing of all: peace.